involved in safety education since 2014, so I'm thrilled to have this as one of our first events coming back, getting back on that important topic. I am Lois Irvin. I lead the Sharonville Chamber and the Northern Cincinnati Safety Council, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. I'd also like to introduce Ashley, who's walking in the door. She's our office manager, and Eddie, who's walking in the door, is our board chair for the chamber. So we're happy to have them here. And is Kelly Ackerman here? She's not. Okay, she's also on our board. So I'd also like to thank all the folks that helped us today. We have Prestige AV always here, always making us look good. Burrs is in the back. We have Jason Dudley here from ICRC, and he is recording this, so we'll be able to share this information. And the staff of the Convention Center is mostly next door, but they also do a great job. If you're ever looking for a place to have an event, this is the place to go. They make you look professional. The person who doesn't look professional is me, since I directed you all to room 111, and I apologize for that. We have several events going on, and they were all in front of me, and I made a mistake. So thank you for finding us. We have resumed all of our events, so if you would like to be on our mailing list and you're not currently on that, please let us know. You can tell us at the desk, and we'll make sure you get information about all of our events. We're going to be hosting a luncheon with the owners of Third Eye Brewery across the street. They have a great story of resilience. They were building, pandemic hit, they kept going, they added picnic tables, they adapted anything they needed to adapt, and here they are a year later going strong. So we're going to hear from them. And then we have another safety topic, a health topic. We have the Health Commissioner, Greg Kesterman, coming in August on the 19th for lunch. So watch for that too. And some of you know that we used to run a Northern Cincinnati Safety Council. We stopped last year during the pandemic. We are going to resume that, and we're going to start in August. It is virtual, so easy to watch. The calendar is out at the desk, so if you're interested in looking at that, take a look. We've got some great topics. We have one of our sponsors today is also a sponsor for the Safety Council, and that is Martha Fulci of 3HAB. Looking good in her beautiful outfit and perfect hair all the time. And I'm not kidding, she always looks good. And Tammy is representing Hunter Consulting. They're our other sponsor today. If you are not aware, Hunter Consulting is a TPA, and Martha runs 3HAB, which is a MCO. Wanted to give them a shout out for helping us today. And again, you'll hear more about Safety Council. I hope to see many of you get involved with that. It's a great way to stay up to date on everything related to safety. So that's it for me, for my announcements, but do watch our email and participate as often as you can. We try to have very relevant information going out, and we're going to get started. We are fortunate to have 3 local experts on safety with us today. Our first session is going to address the current challenges for all of you business owners and managers on what we are allowed to do and not allowed to do, or what it's looking like. I contacted our speaker, Dan, and I said, oh my gosh, the governor just opened everything up. Is this topic going to be any good at the end of the month? And he assured me, he said, oh no, it won't be settled by then. So here we are, and it's still starting to see litigation and all sorts of things for that. So I'd like to introduce Daniel Burke of Graydon Law, and his areas of practice are many areas, but the ones that I was very interested in: workplace health and safety, healthcare, hospitality, and an outlier, craft breweries and distilleries.
Right.
Yes,
Right.
I'm not sure how that's all connected, but you're in the right place. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Lois, and good to be here with all of you. It's good to be somewhere in person. I'm sure everybody can agree with that. So I just have a one-page outline that I'm going to talk from this morning, and you hopefully got a chance to get the handout at the door. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my background. I am an employment lawyer. I've been doing it for about 33 years. And with the Graydon Law Firm, we're in downtown Cincinnati at the Scripps Center. We're also in Northern Kentucky, right near the Northern Kentucky Chamber. And we're also in Liberty Center, right by Brio. And so we work in the employment area, we work with lots of different industries, as Lois alluded to, and see lots of different sizes of employers too, from big companies that have locations throughout the country to much smaller companies. So we've seen quite a lot in the last year and a half through this whole COVID thing, and so I hope to offer you some helpful advice, both legal but also practical advice, and really want this to be about what's valuable to you. I mean, I can go up here and talk about what I think is important, but I'd really welcome your questions and happy to answer them as best I can, but want this to be something that's of value to you. There's no stupid questions, of course. Let's set the scene a little bit as to where we are, as Lois alluded to. The mandates in Ohio and Kentucky from the governors have been dropped, and actually I think that makes it more challenging for employers, because at least under the mandates you had very bright line rules about what you could and couldn't do, and now it's sort of the Wild West a little bit. Well, can we require masks? Yeah, we can. Can we require people to get vaccinated? Yes, we can. The bigger question is, should you? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. I also think it's important, we're coming out of COVID, the mandates have been dropped, but we're also, as everyone in this room is, I'm sure, well aware, in this incredible labor shortage and this war for talent that's almost unprecedented. And I think you can't talk about these issues about COVID policies and what's the right thing to do as an employer without keeping in mind the war for talent, because some of the decisions you might make as an employer might either advantage or disadvantage you in the labor market. And I think that's a real issue that a lot of our clients, at least, are talking to us about when they make these kind of decisions. So with that backdrop, the other thing I think is important is, as good as things are going with the mandates dropped, just, the paper this week is talking about the variants, and this Delta variant particularly. And for the unvaccinated, this is still a very dangerous time. It's no less dangerous now than it was a year ago if you're unvaccinated. And so that's, we got to keep our eye on the ball with these variants and how that's going to impact the decisions. So with that backdrop, I'm going to talk about a few, as you can see, selected workplace COVID issues. And let's start first with employee vaccination issues. So let's talk first about the concept of, in the first place, can I ask my employees if they've been vaccinated? Yes, you can. There was some debate at some point, but yes, you can ask that question, and you can ask for proof of that, whether it's a copy of the vaccination card, or I've seen some clients go to some kind of simple certification form, just having the employee certify in writing that I've been fully vaccinated, and that if that status changes at any time, I will inform my employer and I will provide proof of vaccination if need be. So, that's one way to do it if you don't want to be out there collecting vaccination cards. I think an important question there is, what are you going to do with that information? And first of all, why do you want that information? And I think it's some of the topics we're going to talk about later. It's important to know, I think, the vaccination rate in your workplace, because some of the decisions you might make about your policies and practices would be different if your workplace vaccination rate is 75, 80% than it would be, say, if it's 25 or 30%. And I've been talking to some clients recently that have different locations where they have like 60, 70% in one location, yet another one of their locations is like 20%. And, if you got a location where you only have 20% of your workforce vaccinated, I'm not sure you're in a much different place than we were a year ago with COVID. So I think that's an important piece of information to have to make some of these decisions, and that's why you'd want that information. Certainly, that's employee medical information, so you have to maintain it in a confidential file away from the personnel file, and really limit it to the people that have a need to know, which is probably just the HR people and maybe some of the key managers. So how you maintain that information is important. But for instance, in our firm, we did one of those temperature things on our intranet page showing the percentage of vaccination, because we thought it was important to let people know, because I think it informs their decisions about how comfortable they are returning to the workplace. Again, if it's a workplace where it's less than 50% people vaccinated, I'm not sure how comfortable I feel. If it's 80% of my coworkers are vaccinated, I probably feel pretty comfortable about that. So that's sort of important information about vaccination status. Now let's talk about mandatory vaccination policies. It's been a big topic. From an employment law perspective, EEOC has made it pretty clear that an employer does have the right to require its employees to be vaccinated against COVID, with exceptions. The employer has to abide by people who might need an accommodation or an exception to that because they have an underlying disability. Perhaps they're immunocompromised or have an allergic reaction to the vaccine, so they can't at this point get the vaccine. Or some people have a religious-based objection based on a sincerely held religious belief. I've seen certainly the disability exception being pushed forward. I haven't seen, honestly, too many clients come forward and say, I've got an employee saying they have a religious basis for not getting vaccinated. By my research, I don't know that there are any of the major religions that are actually opposed to the vaccine. I think the Christian Scientist religion has some issues with medical treatment in general, which would include vaccinations, but that could still be out there. So yes, you can require employees to be vaccinated based on employment laws, but as you may have seen in today's paper, and Lois helped point it out to me, there are various states that are reviewing or enacting laws of their own that are prohibiting employers from requiring vaccination. And such a bill is in Ohio's House right now. It hasn't become law, and the governor said, I'm not going to sign something like that. And the Chamber of Commerce in Ohio has come out against that, but that's out there. So, you need to think, yeah, go ahead.
One thing you didn't cover, which is starting to come up, I work at Cincinnati State College, is the folks who have had COVID and had natural immunity,
Right.
and have the antibodies even at a higher level than if you've got the vaccine. Have you encountered that in a legal aspect?
That's a great question. And for instance, just looking again at our own firm, when we did the temperature gauge with vaccination status, we only did proved vaccination status. We did not consider people that had COVID and had developed the antibodies. So I think you could still have a policy, if you're going down the mandatory vaccination route, I think you could still have a policy that says that's not enough, that you had COVID at some point, because that's less clear, at least based in the science, as to how long that's going to last, how effective that is versus the vaccine. But it's a good question that people will likely press. If you would put such a policy in place, Joe may say, well, no, I didn't get the vaccine because I've had COVID. And that may be the basis for that person to say, well, I can't get the vaccine now because I had COVID recently and my doctor's saying I need to wait. So that may be something that would factor into an exemption in that case. Great question. So it's important if you have locations in other parts of the country, perhaps, where you have employees working, that you be aware of the state laws there that might deal with vaccination before you go down the road of mandatory vaccination. But let's talk, so yes, you can. Should you? I can't tell you, I don't think I have a client that I know has gone down the route of mandatory vaccination. So at this point, I think it's a very low percentage of employers that have mandated vaccination. Even a number of clients we have in the long-term care area who you would think dealing with the most vulnerable populations have not gone down that route. And I think there are a couple factors to consider that. One is the very practical factor of the labor market. I think some of those clients I've talked to have said, if we mandate vaccination, we're not going to have STNAs to care for our elders because they're going to go down the street to somebody else who's going to pay them the same or more where there's not a required vaccination. So, that's a real issue, particularly in those kinds of fields of direct care, health care, et cetera. The other is, remember, to this point still, none of these vaccines are fully approved by the FDA. They're all under an emergency use authorization. And part of emergency use authorization is that the individual has the right to refuse it because it's still not a fully approved vaccine. So I think a lot of employers have been hesitant to require it because it's not fully approved yet. I think once that happens, which may be later this summer or fall, I think you'll see many more employers considering the mandatory vaccination route. But that's a big reason it hasn't happened up to this point. The other thing is, when you talk about mandatory vaccination policies, I think you have to be, of course, really cognizant of your workplace and your culture. And how is that going to be perceived? Is that going to be perceived as Big Brother sort of jamming something down my throat? So that's sort of the status on mandatory vaccination policies. If you do go down that route of mandatory vaccination policies, it would be really important to develop a really good policy that talks about why we're doing this, what it actually means, what period of time you have in which to get vaccinated, what the exemptions are, so basically disability and religious. We developed a form policy that includes a form for each of those exemptions. So if Dan's requesting an exemption from the vaccination requirement based on a disability, here's a form he's got to fill out, including doctor's information. And then I think you have to think carefully about who within the company is going to review these exemptions. It probably should be a multidisciplinary group like HR, perhaps if you have safety people, perhaps somebody in management, because these are going to be some tough questions. So you have the exemption process, and then what do you do with somebody that has an exemption? Okay, so Dan's not required to get the vaccine because of a disability. Well, what do we do with him? Everybody else in his work team is vaccinated. So then you have to think about your obligations of reasonable accommodation, right, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, because this person has a disability. So are they able to continue to work in the office with masking, social distancing, those kinds of things? Is there a separate office space that they could be placed in away from others? If those don't work in the workplace, then we have to think about, is remote work still a reasonable accommodation for that person? So those are sort of the issues around mandatory vaccination policies. Yeah, sure.
So on the religious exemption, employee comes to you and says, hey, I'm not going to take this vaccine because of my religious beliefs. There's sort of that impasse that really, as an employer, there's nothing you can do other than acknowledge that and honor it.
Well, you can push. It depends, but I think you're practically saying, yeah, but do I really want to? So, for instance, the form that we developed with this policy for employers that want to consider that for a religious exemption has them, describe the religious belief or practice that necessitates this request for you to not have the vaccine, and asks the employee to describe any alternatives that might address their religious concerns. If you really wanted to press it further, you could require them to provide something from their religious authority that supports that this is a sincerely held religious belief. So I think that's part of the reason to have a good policy and a form to at least make people walk through that process rather than just say, oh, okay, you're right, I got a religious belief that prevents me from doing that. Well, what is it? Well, I'm not sure, but I want an exemption. So that's, I think, the importance of a policy like that. But you make a good point, and what's a sincerely held religious belief can be a pretty broad category. It doesn't have to just be the tenet of a major recognized religion. Veganism has been litigated about whether that's a religious basis for it. But very good question. Let's see. Another question to consider if you're going to go down the road of mandatory vaccinations is, okay, everybody's got to get vaccinated. Are you going to provide that to them on site? Or are you going to, maybe you have healthcare components within your company. Maybe you are a healthcare employer and you have nurses, et cetera. Are you going to do it yourself, or are you going to require them to go to CVS or Walgreens and get the vaccination? And just be mindful, if you do decide to do it yourself, you have some greater obligations because you are going to obtain, things like medical history, et cetera, that you have to be careful about how you maintain that information and decisions you make, maybe learning about somebody's family history, for instance, in questioning them before they get the vaccine. So probably the safer bet at this point is to tell people to go get it somewhere else and provide proof of it to the company. All right, let's move from mandatory vaccinations to vaccination incentive programs. So a lot of employers have already got a lot of people that have become vaccinated, but I think a lot of employers, or at least our clients, are sort of plateaued. They've got maybe 60% or so, and they've got that stubborn 40% that they can't move the dial, either because, and certainly not all of that are people that have valid medical reasons not to. A lot of it is they don't want it yet because it's not fully approved and they're sort of in a wait and see, or there's a fair amount of people that have a political objection to this for a number of reasons. So I think employers are looking for ways to move that needle without going to the mandated route. And so there was a lot of concern about, well, what can I do to incentivize vaccination? You've seen lots of things about it, from our governor offering $1 million to, I think, some company offering free beer to employees, to everything in between. And it was sort of the Wild West, and everybody was waiting for EEOC to provide some guidance, which they did recently. They essentially green-lighted incentive programs, but said you can do so as long as the incentive you offer isn't coercive, isn't so generous that people feel coerced to provide information to you that maybe they didn't want to. And of course, it's sometimes the case. EEOC didn't provide any real helpful guidance on what coercive means. So, is a $100 gift certificate coercive? Probably not. I've seen some employers go that route, or a $100 bonus, or maybe a $100 contribution to the employee's HSA. Those are some various things we've heard about. I think if you go with things that are much more valuable than that, you are sort of getting into a gray area. The other gray area is, these kinds of programs, incentives that have to do with employee health and wellness, can be governed by the rules that deal with employee wellness programs. And so, as you know, there's a whole body of rules that relate to those, one of which is, if it is deemed a wellness program, you have to provide an alternative route for an individual that, in this case, can't get the vaccination because of a disability, to earn that incentive some other way. So maybe they go through a short educational program, a video or something about the benefits of vaccination, or something like that. And again, that's still an unclear area. So I'd suggest, if you're going down the road of incentives, that really important to review that with legal counsel before you're doing that. I think, again, back to practical advice, the other thing I hear clients say is, well, why should I offer an incentive now? 70% of my people went out and did it on their own without needing an incentive. Why should I incent the people, the 30%, that just aren't doing it because they don't want to? And so I think that's an important, again, that gets to culture issues. And so many of these decisions you have to make, you really have to make sure you're not creating unintended consequences that may really impact your employee culture. Okay, so let's move from vaccination issues to workplace reentry issues. So many employers are moving to reentry, whether it's a phased reentry to the workspace, the shared workspace, or a full reentry. Again, just to give an example, our firm, for example, went, as of June 1st, we asked that a majority of our people be in the shared workspace a majority of the week. We didn't mandate which days those are, but so 3 days a week, we'd like most of our people to be there. So we're still experimenting with that, and I think lots of employers are experimenting with, well, what should that look like for us? So some of the talk about, as you think about reentry and what that's going to look like for you, just touch on some of the guidance that is out there. I saw Ken Montgomery step in here at some point, and I know he's going to obviously talk about OSHA's guidance for the workplace. As you know, I'm sure you know, OSHA came out within the last couple of weeks with a new standard that has requirements that are limited to the healthcare setting. They also updated some of their guidance for non-healthcare settings, but really nothing shockingly new there. And the focus of OSHA on the non-healthcare settings was really just an employer's obligations to protect its unvaccinated workforce. OSHA basically said you don't have to put requirements in place for your vaccinated workforce. And which followed the CDC guidance, as you know, that came out that said basically vaccinated individuals don't have to mask, don't have to social distance, don't have to quarantine when they've been exposed, and basically can carry on life as they see fit. So that's, and Ken will go over into more detail, I think, on some of the guidance from OSHA and maybe where OSHA is heading in those areas. But let's see, what do we do with that now that there's no mask mandates in place? And I think that's been a real challenge for a lot of the clients we've spoken to. Well, what should we do about masking in the workplace? There's no requirement. The CDC has said your vaccinated workers have no obligation, don't need to wear a mask. So you're left with, okay, well then what about my unvaccinated workforce? And I think most employers, as we were approaching the date when Ohio dropped the mandate in early June, saying, man, once that mandate goes down, I don't know how I'm going to require people to wear masks anymore. So that's what we're seeing a lot is I think that got dropped completely, or we've seen a number of employers go to a recommendation. So the recommendation that if you're not vaccinated, we recommend, perhaps strongly recommend, that you wear a mask while you're in the workplace. But I think that's now an employer-by-employer decision because there's no rules requiring it. So that's where I think you really get into some challenging questions about what we're going to do here. And so I think the kinds of things you need to consider when you're considering what your masking policy is going to be for unvaccinated workers is, what kind of work do we do? Are our employees public-facing? Particularly, are they public-facing with vulnerable populations like elderly, children, healthcare settings? Are they public-facing in the hospitality industry? And then that's where this question we talked about before of what's your vaccination rate in this workplace is really important. Because, again, if you have an 80% vaccination rate, you might feel pretty comfortable with saying no masking requirements for employees. It's a suggestion that you do it. But I think if you've got a place where it's significantly less than 50% of a vaccination rate, you really have some hard decisions to make. I think you're hard-pressed not to keep in place most of the protocols you had before as far as requiring people to wear masks, requiring unvaccinated people to wear masks, keeping social distancing in place, and certainly keeping in place all the protocols you've had in place when somebody tests positive for COVID and reports that, or reports that they were exposed to somebody who tested positive. So you've got to keep in place all of the policies about contact tracing, quarantining of unvaccinated workers in that situation. So that's where I think the real challenge is going to be is for employers in those places where it's a really low vaccination rate. I think that then leads us to the reality that many workplaces are going to be sort of two-tiered, and they're going to be in two classes of employees, the vaccinated who aren't wearing masks and the unvaccinated folks who are wearing masks. And that, from a legal perspective, that's okay. EEOC has said you can basically treat people differently based on vaccination status. But practically speaking, how does that feel in my workplace? Do we really want to create a place where people feel like second-class citizens? Do we want to create a place where people are policing that? Well, Lois isn't wearing a mask. Why isn't Lois wearing a mask? Well, that's not your issue, Dan. But you know how that's going to go. And there are people going to be saying, I'm pretty sure Lois isn't vaccinated, and I'm not sure why she's not wearing a mask. Just an example. Just an Okay, thank you. Very good. And we had an example within our firm of one of our smaller offices and an individual that had been very vocal about not being vaccinated and had to be, talked to directly about it. So then you get into the issue of, okay, if we're going to have different rules for unvaccinated versus vaccinated, how are we going to document that? So are we going to require proof of everybody's vaccination? Are we going to rely on the honor system? So all those issues, I think, come into place. I think when you're in this two-class workplace now, it will be really important to make sure your managers are well-trained. Those frontline managers are well-trained about what they can and shouldn't be asking about. They shouldn't be asking, Dan, why is he wearing a mask? Well, I'm not vaccinated. Well, why aren't you vaccinated? Well, because I have an underlying disability. Wow. In 3 short questions, we've gained information that we probably shouldn't have had, and now we've got it. So, and you know how it goes. It's easy for us to lay all this out right now in this nice conference room. It's quite different when you're in the press of the workday in a manufacturing plant or, a fast-paced restaurant, et cetera, and those kind of things get talked about. Or the rumor mill goes around about, gee, Dan's not, why isn't he wearing a mask? Well, I hear he's got a family history of. So real important to be training managers to not ask those questions themselves, and probably more importantly, to be sensitive to and stop those kind of conversations when they come up in the workplace. Okay, let's talk. Any questions at this point before I move on to sort of the last area? Okay. Let's talk about remote work policies and practices post-COVID. Because while we're going to have people re-entering the workplace and we're going to have hybrid policies, we still have to be thinking about remote work. And I think it's really important to, at this point in time, as we're coming out of COVID, to be very intentional about whatever your telecommuting or remote work or work from anywhere, whatever you want to call it, policy is. Because what happened in the last 15 months is not a remote work policy. That was a crisis response mandated by the government, essentially, to have everybody work from home. And it's a mistake, I think, to just simply roll that forward in the post-COVID area as an employer. I think that limits your flexibility. It limits your rights to determine who you're going to allow from work from home and who you aren't. So I think it's really important at this point to be intentional about what your policy is going to be in that regard. So let's talk a minute about what a policy like that would look like. I think you want to address things like we are going to determine what jobs are suitable for remote work, because not every job is, and what employees are suitable for remote work, because not every employee is. Maybe they're a new employee. Maybe they've had performance or attendance issues, or those kind of issues. And so we have the right to say, no, Dan, you're not going to be able to work from home because of these reasons. So I think that's a first critical component of those kind of policies is job and employee suitability. Then there's a whole host of things you have to be thinking about what the remote workspace should look like. So if we're going to allow people to work from home on a sort of ongoing basis, we need to be concerned about, ergonomics in the home workspace, just like we did probably during COVID, but probably now more of a concern because this may be an ongoing thing. So, the desk, the chair, those kind of things. Safety issues, what kind of workplace do they have at home? You would want to define what the home workspace is, because if somebody's going to get a cup of coffee and falls down the stairs and gets hurt, have we suddenly just bought a workers' comp claim, right? Because it happened in the course of employment. So in these remote work policies, it would be important to identify what is the workspace and what are the work hours. So, well, Dan fell down the steps at 1 in the morning. Well, those weren't his work hours. He shouldn't have been working at 1 in the morning, and so we're going to deny that claim. So safety issues, obviously data security, hugely important factor, was during COVID, will continue to be going forward. You'd want to have really rigorous protocols in place about people who are working from home and how that data that they're handling is being kept secure in that home work environment. And recording of time worked. So for your non-exempt employees that you're allowing to work from home, as you know, all time worked is compensable. So you have to establish some kinds of policies or procedures, whether it's electronic time reporting, some other manner of reporting, so that you're capturing all of that. So I think that's really important if you're going to go down the remote work policy, which I think, let's talk again practically, the reality of allowing employees to work remotely is changed. So whatever we thought before COVID, if we were like, nah, we're old school, people need to be in their seats and I need to see them. That ship has sailed. Yeah.
I'm hearing a lot about people having questions as it relates to paying differently for somebody who's in office versus out of office.
Yeah.
And I'm curious your thoughts on that, because that feels like a very slippery slope.
I think that, I don't like that at all. Yeah, I've read about that. I think that's, as I've read about it at least, I think that's more of an issue in big metropolitan markets where the cost of living and commuting is dramatically different for people working from home as to others. But yeah, I think that's a very slippery slope. And again, would be a reason to be very intentional about how you're going to deal with that in a policy. So, that should be more of a going forward type of situation. Okay, we're going to begin this new remote work policy January 1. And as beginning January 1, we're going to have different pay structures for those issues. But I don't know, I'd be really cautious about going down that road.
And kind of follow-up to that, there's also been a lot of conversation as it relates to taxability of those employees.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that, and what kind of headaches do you think that would create for employers?
Yeah, that's already created issues about what tax treatment for employees that are working from home. That's one issue, but a lot of employees work in other states and sometimes in other countries. And I don't think the IRS is quite caught up with that. I think this will be an opportunity for those policies to be clarified. So it's a big issue. It's a huge red flag issue that you need to at least make sure you're aware that that's an issue and identify it in this policy, because you're right, there could be implications about, all right, where are we withholding taxes from and where are we not? It also raises issues about, to the extent employees might be working in other countries, whether it's Canada, Mexico, other places, you potentially have issues about their right to work in another country, just like we have issues about people's their eligibility to work in the United States. You could, if you have an employee working 3 months in Cancun, there may be some rules in that area that require them to be registered. Tax issues, of course, and you could run afoul of that by allowing that to continue. So, and that one of the topics I wanted to talk about was, this temporary working vacation option I was reading about. Some people call it a vaxication. That some employers, as we're moving into the summer here, want to do things for employees that have been suffering through COVID and allowing somebody to work from the Rocky Mountains for the next 2 months or from Cancun, et cetera. And, again, it's a new day. So things like that. And again, as we talked about at the very beginning, the tight labor market and demand for talent might say to you, well, I really need to be thinking about sort of out-of-the-box things like that because I need to attract and retain the best talent. So just be aware, as the question was just asked, that if you do allow those kind of things, think about the tax implications, and if it's out of the country, think about perhaps the right to work implications. Let's talk about remote work policies and people's requests to work remotely. So this is where I think we're seeing some real difficulty, that the employee that was working remotely for the last 15 months, doing a fine job, and now it's time to come back to the workplace. And they say, Dan, I really don't want to come back to the workplace. Well, why not? Well, you said I was doing great, my job great from home, I'm being just as productive, and I'd just like to continue to do that. So what can an employer do? Well, that's not a good enough reason. That's not a disability-based reason. So there's no right to work from home in that setting. But it is more challenging, I think. I think an employer, as we come into this post-COVID area, employers are really going to have to make the business case to their employees about why is it you need to do this job in the workspace. Because it's not going to be enough, I don't think, to just say because that's the way we did it before, and that's the way we're going to do it forward. I think you're going to lose people. You won't attract, I think, particularly some of the younger people in the workforce who are looking for that flexibility. And so I think right now is the time to really think hard about what's the compelling business reason to do it in the workplace. There are lots of reasons. It might be, I have some clients in sort of the architecture area, and they've said, over the last 16 months, the work was getting done, but our designs weren't as good as they were. They weren't as cutting edge, and that's because we need in-person collaboration of our teams, and we need them working together, and working from home indefinitely is not going to cut it. Or in a workplace like ours, a professional services firm, a law firm, we've again found that we really need to be in the same space together, particularly bringing younger people, newer employees into the workplace. Really challenging, I think, to onboard somebody new in a remote work environment. They really need people elbow to elbow with them to do that. So there's lots of good reasons, I think, compelling reasons you can make about why it is necessary for us to work together. And part and parcel of that is, and it's safe. And we've followed all these protocols, and again, we come back again to the vaccination rate, and we have 75% of the workforce vaccinated. So it's important for us to be together, it's safe for us to be together, and so we want you to work in the workplace. And I think if you've given that compelling reason and you have a safe workplace, then you're going to blunt a lot of employees' ability, at least, to make a convincing case for why they should be able to work from home. You're still going to get those cases, and I think you tread carefully when you get those and try to work through with the person about coaxing them back in. Maybe, let's do this in a phased approach. Let's have you come in 1 day a week and then 2 days a week, and let's work our way up to it somehow. But ultimately, I think if you've made those kinds of attempts with the individual, you're going to get to a point where we might have to say, well, we're going to part ways because this job needs to be done in the workspace. It's perfectly safe. We've tried to accommodate the concerns you've raised, and you're unwilling to do so, and so we're going to part ways with you. So those are some important issues, I think, to deal with on reasonable accommodation. And then the last point is just, I think hybrid work policies. I think it's sort of a new world again, like in our workspace where we've got people 3 days a week maybe working in the office and 2 days at home. So some practical concerns. How do you handle meetings now? So your team of 8 people has a meeting on Wednesday, and 4 of the people are in the office, and 4 of the people are working remotely. So really, not as much a legal concern as a practical concern. How do we make that an effective meeting with 4 people on Zoom and 4 people in the office? And I saw an interesting suggestion about that was in a setting like that, have each of the people that are in the office assigned to one of the people that's remote as sort of a buddy. And that person's job is to be particularly aware of whether the remote person is missing something. Maybe, or the remote person's trying to speak up and is not getting an opportunity. And maybe the person in the office texts Dan, who's remote, and says, hey, you missed this or something. And I thought that's an interesting way to make those meetings still effective. Because you're naturally going to get the feeling of the people that are not in the office that they're missing out on something, and that somehow they're not fully engaged. Again, that's going to be, as we move into hybrid work practices, really important training for managers on how to handle those issues sensitively and how to try to get people together and maybe establish 1 day a week that's a core day, and that's when we're going to try to do the meetings. We want everybody in the office on Wednesdays, and the rest of the week we can be flex with. So I think because one of the legal issues that can come out of this in a hybrid workplace is inconsistency, right? So you are treating people differently, and you want to be careful that that doesn't somehow become a matter of, well, how does it happen that the people that are being treated less favorably happen to be women or older employees or employees that have medical reasons? So then now we're down the slippery slope of making distinctions in our work practices based on protected classes, which, as we know, we can't. Questions? Any questions? Those are most of the topics I thought were important to cover. Happy to answer any other questions. Yeah.
So I've got an employee who's been very vocal about not wanting to get vaccines. You also have to be a poor performer. So 3 months from now, we want to make a decision that it's time to separate from that employee. What are the expectations I have to come back and now is it plain discrimination, and the reason I'm getting rid of him is because he refused to get vaccinated? What was the scenario?
Yeah, really realistic question, because it's happening right now all the time. And that's where it's really important to have these policies and protocols in place about why are you not getting the vaccine. If you're not getting the vaccine because I don't want to, it's an infringement on my liberty, I'm politically opposed to it, there's no legal basis for you to make that claim, and you can be fired. If it's an at-will employee, we have the right to fire them for any reason or no reason that's not illegal. So there's no protected class for having a political basis not to get the vaccine. Now, that's, yeah, easy to say that's what the law is, but much more difficult to put that in practice. And, you know, you don't want to be a workplace where it's seen that you're targeting people based on their political beliefs. So I think that's a tricky one, and I think that's why it's important to have these policies in place about vaccination. And that's why, it's important to know your vaccination rate. So if we've got an 80% vaccination rate and that person's one of the 20%, yeah, maybe I'm not that concerned about it. If I have an under 50% workplace vaccination rate and I'm really trying to get those numbers up, if I got a bunch of people like that, then I do have a big concern. And again, all of this has to be understood in the context of the labor market right now. So am I willing to go out and fire 5 people because they're opposed to the vaccine? You know, am I going to be able to find 5 new people? I think that's really what the challenging issue is right now, I think.